أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على خير خلقك محمد وأهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. Imam Hassan ibn Ali Al-Askari, the 11th Imam of the Ahlul Bayt, alayhim afdalu salatu wasalam, provides a guideline toward the followers, toward his Shia, in terms of what qualities they need to look toward within the scholars before they decide to imitate or perform taqleed of that particular alim. We find in the previous discussion, we mentioned that the first quality needed to truly be an alim, a scholar, according to the definition of the Ahlul Bayt, is he who puts in the time to become amongst what is known as the fuqaha, as the Imam alayhi salatu wasalam states, فَأَمَّا مَنْ كَانَ مِنَ الْفُقَهَا. Surely that from those scholars, those jurists, those who understand the verses of the Holy Quran and the narrations of the Ahlul Bayt and are able to determine exactly how to deduce from these sources. We find that the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt, from their time, long before the time of Imam Hassan ibn Ali Al-Askari, trained their closest companions and their closest confidants in terms of exactly how to become amongst the fuqaha, or how to become amongst the mujtahideen that we have present today. We find, for example, we have scholars by the name of Muhammad ibn Muslim, who was amongst the closest companions of Imam al-Sadiq. He states, "Ma shajara fi qalbi shay'un illa wa sa'altu Abu Ja'far ibn Muhammad al-Sadiq hatta سألته عن 16,000 مسألة." That not one question became apparent in my heart until I asked that question toward Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salatu wasalam, until I asked him 16,000 questions. Every one of them, Imam al-Sadiq responds toward. Similarly, we find that Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salatu wasalam has between 4,000 and 20,000 students, according to Sheikh al-Mufid, 4,000 of those which were amongst his closest confidants. The Imam alayhi salatu wasalam would advise some of his companions who went toward him and said, "Yabna Rasulullah, O Imam al-Sadiq, we have a question in regards to certain religious matters." He wouldn't answer them directly. Oftentimes we see that the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt would go and pass on their companions and say, instead of asking me, go and ask Muhammad ibn Muslim. Or do not ask me, go and ask my other great companion Zurara ibn A'yun. We find that a companion like Zurara ibn A'yun, he approaches Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salatu wasalam, and he states himself, "40 عاما كنت أسأل أحكام لإمام الصادق عليه الصلاة والسلام عن مسألة الحج." That for 40 years I was asking Imam al-Sadiq the ahkam, I was learning from him the laws of Hajj, the performing of the tawaf around the holy Kaaba, the ahkam of performing the dhabiha, the ahkam of performing the sa'i when you walk or run between Safa and Marwa. إِلَى تَنْتَهِي مَسْأَلِ الْحَجِّ. When will the questions of Hajj, when will this ahkam of Hajj end? Because we've been studying it for 40 years, O Imam al-Sadiq. At that moment, Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salatu wasalam responds toward him. He says, "O Zurara, بيت يحج إليه قبل آدم ب1000 عام تريد أن تفنى مسائله في 40 عاما." He says that this house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, 200 years before the creation of Adam, there were certain species, perhaps the angels, who were performing the tawaf around it. And you want to complete its laws only within 40 years. Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salatu wasalam is trying to demonstrate even to his closest companions in terms of matters of jurisprudence that the religion of Islam is deep and one must put in the time. لا يجوز العلم إلا من يطيل درسه. That surely knowledge will not be allowed in the hearts and in the minds of people except for those who put in the time to study. Thus we find that the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt, as we mentioned, would prepare for scholars to take over in terms of answering a lot of the questions that come in matters of issues of jurisprudence, in matters of issues of the tafsir of the Holy Quran, in matters like the riwayat and the ahadith of the Ahlul Bayt, and so on and so forth. We find that Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salatu wasalam, as we mentioned, has between 4,000 and 20,000 students. 4,000 perhaps who are amongst his true followers, who learnt and benefited from the riwayat, from the teachings of Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salatu wasalam. As we mentioned, he would go and advise people, do not ask me, go and ask Zurara, go and ask Muhammad ibn Muslim, and so on and so forth. What was the reason for Imam al-Sadiq doing this? Perhaps one reason is that he was preparing the community for the greater occultation of Imam Sahib al-Zaman, this period that we are in right now. And the idea that there's going to come a time where the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt are going to become absent toward the general population of the Shia. Furthermore, we find that only a few years after the martyrdom of Imam Ja'far ibn Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, we find that there are a group that Imam Musa ibn Ja'far al-Kadhim alayhi salatu wasalam, he came forth to establish his Imam, of course, as the son of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, and he was put into prison for many years under the Abbasid Khulafa. Yet we find that when people desired to go toward Imam Musa ibn Ja'far and ask him questions, they were unable to because he was in prison. That's what happened. The followers of the Ahlul Bayt, they began to go to those fuqaha, those students of Imam al-Sadiq, those students of Imam Musa ibn Ja'far al-Kadhim alayhi salatu wasalam, and used to ask them the questions because they were well versed within Islamic law, within the verses of the Holy Quran, and within the traditions and the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salatu wasalam. But going back toward this first phrase, within the narration of the Imam alayhi salatu wasalam, he states, فَأَمَّا مَنْ كَانَ مِنَ الْفُقَهَا. Surely those from our scholars, the fuqaha, the jurists. Where exactly do the jurists take knowledge from? Of course, as we mentioned, that the true faqih, the true mujtahid, the true alim, the true scholar who has been a student of the Ahlul Bayt and their sciences are those who cling on solely toward the teachings of the Holy Quran and the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salatu wasalam, and those sciences and those sources of knowledge which the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salatu wasalam has advised their companions to take from. We find that in a narration from Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salatu wasalam toward Kumail, he says, Ya Kumail, la ta'khudh illa anna takun minna. That if you desire to be with us, the Ahlul Bayt, then make sure that you only take knowledge from us. Thus Imam Al-Askari alayhi salatu wasalam states, فَأَمَّا مَنْ كَانَ مِنَ الْفُقَهَا. That surely there are those scholars, those fuqaha, those mujtahideen. And then he goes on to mention the next several qualities of the ulama, the true scholars on the path of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim afdalu salatu wa salam. فَأَمَّا مَنْ كَانَ مِنَ الْفُقَهَا صَائِنًا لِنَفْسِهِ حَافِظًا لِدِينِهِ. That surely those scholars, those individuals who study our sciences, the sciences of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim afdalu salatu wa salam, who protect and preserve their own selves, and they are protectors of their own religion. We mentioned that the first quality of the scholars is the individual who puts in the time, who studies the sciences of the Ahlul Bayt, who recognizes the verses of the Holy Quran and the narrations of the Imams. One side is the academic perspective, the other side is the moral, the ethical, the akhlaqi perspective of the ulama. That it is not enough for an individual to memorize what is in the books. It is not enough for someone to memorize the entire Quran, but he must be a man who opens his heart toward Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, toward the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt. And he himself lives like the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt and like the Prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. من كان من الفقهاء صائنا لنفسه حافظا لدينه. And truly the ulama, truly the greatest of scholars are those who not only memorize what are in the books, but they practice those which are within the narrations of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salatu wasalam. Not everyone who dresses in a religious garb, not everyone who claims that they've studied in the Islamic seminary can be considered a man, can be considered an individual who truly has the insight to become amongst the mujtahideen, to become amongst the maraja. But an individual who protects his own religion, who preserves his own heart, who preserves his own self, who has cultivated his heart to constantly and consistently be receptive toward the teachings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, submitting toward Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on all occasions. He is one who truly understands Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Thus we find that in a book like Kitab al-Kafi, compiled by, of course, Sheikh al-Kulayni in the earlier ghaiba, in the earlier period of the ghaiba, we find that we have 16,000 narrations of the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt, from the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, from Ali ibn Abi Talib, from Imam al-Sadiq, from Imam al-Baqir. One by one we have thousands upon thousands of narrations of the Ahlul Bayt, of course, and we mention that we recite toward the Ahlul Bayt in Ziyarat Jami' al-Kabira, Ya Ahl Bayt al-Nubuwah, Kalamukum Nur, your words are a light. But not everyone can be receptive toward that light. Only those who have cultivated their hearts, who have allowed their hearts to be receptive. It is said that one day Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salatu wasalam, he was with his close companion Kumail ibn Ziyad. He says, "O Kumail, surely the greatest of hearts are the hearts which are most receptive toward knowledge." But a heart cannot be receptive toward knowledge unless it has submitted toward Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. من كان من الفقهاء صائنا لنفسه. He is one who has preserved himself. حافظا لدينه. He recognizes his role in the religion of Islam. وما خلقت الجن والإنس إلا ليعبدون. We did not create man except to become one who worships Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To be a scholar in the true meaning of a scholar, one needs to constantly be in submission toward Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For one who practices ijtihad, who is a mujtahid in terms of deducing laws from the verses of the Holy Quran and from the narrations of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salatu wasalam, for one who truly does that with true sincerity on the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Imam Al-Askari alayhi salatu wasalam says, then he can be amongst those who one imitates and one follows. فَأَمَّا مَنْ كَانَ مِنَ الْفُقَهَاءِ صَائِلًا لِنَفْسِهِ حافظا لدينه مخالفا لحواه مطيعا لأمر مولاه فللأوام أن يقلدوه. Inshallah, in the next session we will discuss what is the final quality that one needs to look for when they are examining the scholars or those individuals who have studied the sciences of the Ahlul Bayt before they walk in their footsteps, before, as Imam Al-Askari states, فللأوام أن يقلدوه. That surely once he has fulfilled all of these prerequisites, then one should follow him. Inshallah, we will discuss more in depth in these words of Imam Hassan al-Askari alayhi salatu wasalam. Walhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina wa Nabiyyina Muhammad wa Ahl Baytih at-Tayyibin at-Tahirin.